Afternoon. I wish first of all to thank Mr. Celos and the organizer for having given me the privilege to chair this session. I think this meeting has a peculiarity that perhaps is the only occasion in which many people who have been part of this group from the beginning, from its foundation, are present, together with many new people, many younger people, that come to the group only recently. And so I think that it is important to try to create a kind of link between the group was, how the group was in the past, and how it was founded, and what is the group now, and particularly what the group should be in the future. And so some reflection on this very long history, which hopefully has been successful, since there are so many young people, new people coming here, and I'm sure there will be even more in future meetings. Perhaps in the future meeting, not all of us will be able to come at the numbers as we are in this occasion. And this reflection obviously has to be started by Mann, because Mann has been a real founder of this group. He's the one who started this initiative. He started by trying to convince some of the people in Turkey at that time mission to create this group. In the beginning, it was not easy. There were very few, but started to progress, and we are now what we are. So I think it is nice that we have this opportunity to ask Jim to tell us a little bit how we have come to this point and to give us some hints on what the group should go on in the future. Please, Jim.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Gabriele, and thank you to the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity. I would like to do a number of things. I'd like to pay tribute to those who came right at the beginning and who are not here anymore, because we owe a lot to them, and just talk very briefly about some of the achievements of the group, and then give you just a couple of thoughts, my thoughts, as it were, on where we might give some time and thought. Now, the first thing I want to say is this is not the 41st meeting of the group. This is the 42nd meeting of the group, because the first meeting of the group was held in January 1982. But before I go down that track, I really just want to tell you a little bit about how the group was formed, because I know that not everybody is aware of that. Towards the end of the 1970s, I know lots of people weren't born at that stage, but some of us were really quite old. At the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, there was a strong awareness amongst those people that knew what was happening that saturated fat was a causal factor in coronary heart disease, that people with diabetes were primarily dying from coronary heart disease, and that what was happening in many parts of Europe, most especially in Britain, but also in other parts of Europe, that people were being recommended a low carbohydrate, not ketogenic, but a lowish carbohydrate diet, less than 40% total energy, which means that they were having quite a high fat intake, and they were having a high saturated fat intake. And we started to debate this issue at the epidemiology study group of the ESD. The epidemiology study group was, I think, one of the earliest, if not the earliest study group of the ESD. And the reason it was discussed there was because much of the data was epidemiological. But of course, there was other data. I mean, we knew about the effect of saturated fat on total and LDL cholesterol and so on. And the issue became such a hot topic that about a half a dozen to 12 of us thought that we really needed to give some serious attention to this matter, and maybe it was worth organizing a group. So we planned to have a meeting of what right from the very beginning was known as the Diabetes and Nutrition Study Group. And the meeting was to be held at my invitation in Oxford, where I lived for a significant part of my life before going to New Zealand, was going to be held in January 1982, as you can see. And the only problem was that January 1982, there was a whiteout in the southern part of England, and the people that were meant to be coming to this meeting couldn't come. Heathrow Airport was shut. It was impossible to get to Heathrow. But miraculously, and I can't remember how they got there, these people actually got to Oxford for this meeting. And this was the first meeting where we really decided that there was going to be a group, and we decided that the group would have two primary aims. One was to develop guidelines for the nutritional management of diabetes. And number two, we were going to try and work out how these guidelines could be implemented, because there was no serious organization about implementation of nutrition advice to diabetes. And I'm very sad to say, note the passing of many people on this in this small group there. Monica Turner sends her best wishes for this meeting. I thought that we should probably start off giving these people some idea of the kind of diet that we had been studying, particularly our two groups in Naples and in Oxford, where we did a lot of work on dietary fiber. So we planned that my secretary would organize all the meals for the 3 or 4 days that we were going to meet. And the meals were the ones that we've been using in our experimental studies, which subsequently went into this book. And we thought it was quite a good idea to try it out on these people. Well, I would have to say that to start off with, they thought it was disgusting. And the only reason they had to eat the food was because the weather was so bad, they couldn't go out and get any food anywhere else. Actually, the food in Oxford wasn't worth eating in those days anyway. There were no decent places to eat. I think it's improved a little bit since then. But the interesting thing was it only took about 3 or 4 days before they actually accepted the food wasn't really that bad, and it was actually quite nice. And they actually thanked my secretary for all the work that she did. Those people, I think, were probably, and I'm one of them, I think I'm the only one here, should be really the great-grandparents of this group. But there are also a number of people who were very involved at the earliest stages of this group. And I've got pictures of them there. I couldn't, unfortunately, find a picture of Ivo de Leo or Britta Karlstrom, but Britta is here, so that's fine, and she's showing herself if you don't know who she is. There were hundreds of pictures of Mike on the internet, as you might imagine, but the one that I kind of did a screenshot, and it's probably my fault not doing a screenshot properly, was very blurred. So I thought, well, Mike was here too, so you could see what he looks like if you didn't know. But these people really, I think, and I put the parents and the grandparents together so as not to offend anybody. But there's some people who actually were very young when they first came to these meetings. And Ulf was a good example. He came with his mentors to the early meetings, Bengt and Britta. And it's wonderful that Ulf is our host on this occasion, because he's just been a member of this group all the way through, really from some of the earliest meetings I think I did, perhaps not the very first one in Crete, but you were still at school then, I think, probably. But Ulf's been around a long time, and Luc van Gaal too was somebody who came along to the early meetings. But there were also some who'd been around a bit longer. But so these, I think, I regard these people as parents and grandparents. Rather a young parent in the case of Ulf, but there we are. So I want to talk now. So I really want to pay credit to that group of people. What I want to do next is really just to talk about the guidelines that we have produced over the years, fairly briefly, and also just say a few words about implementation. So I think most of you know that there have been 5 sets of guidelines since we started. The first 3 sets of guidelines were really old-fashioned guidelines based on expert opinion. We sat round, we knew what was right, and we decided what was going to be done. The second last one, we used the Scottish sign system for judging the evidence. And the last one, as I think most of you know, we used GRADE, which is regarded as the ultimate one to use in order to produce the evidence-based guidelines published last year in Diabetologia, which I hope everybody has studied and memorized. What I would like to do, and I've got 6 slides, and I'm going to just go through a couple of them very quickly, because I want to show you something to make a point. And I just want to look at three sets of the guidelines. The very first one, the second one in 2004, which is the first evidence-based guideline, and our 2023. And I'll just spend a little time on carbohydrate to show you how things have or have not changed much. We recommended 1988 a substantial range of carbohydrate, saying you could go down to 40%, but please don't go down below 40%, which is what most people in Europe were doing at that stage. We did pretty much the same intakes in 2004. We moved away from precise numbers in 2023, but nevertheless, there was still a pretty general picture that a wide range was acceptable. I particularly want to draw your attention to something in this next slide about carbohydrate, which is about dietary fiber, which just happens to be more than a passing interest of mine, as many of you know. Interestingly, based on the original experimental work of Naples and Oxford, we came up with saying that you should have, bearing in mind most people had about 2,000 calorie diets in those days, it would be great to try and achieve 40 grams, just based on our experiments. Interestingly enough, when we came to actually doing a proper evaluation of the literature, both in 2004 and 2023, we came up with those virtually identical figures. And really, many other things remained the same. I mean, glycemic index in 1988 was something that we were talking about and we thought was interesting. By 2023, we were saying, yeah, glycemic index is a reasonably good way of deciding what food should be recommended, provided the other criteria were the same. It was really quite remarkable how well we did in 1988 and how relatively few changes there have been. I think we've had a great improvement, and we've certainly refined what we've done. But in general, I think that we have been pretty much consistent in what we've said about carbohydrate, what we've said about fiber, what we've said about glycemic index, and actually advising against very low carbohydrate intakes. We didn't then know about ketogenic diets. I am going to not go through the rest of these slides in great detail because I've made the general point. Interestingly, just to comment on the free sugars or the added sugars, again, we came up with a rather small amount of free and added sugars originally, pretty much again based on work that Mike did. Yes, you did work on free sugars. You may have forgotten about it, but you did some work on free sugars. We did work on free sugars. We said 30 grams. Well, we've now come up to 10% of total energy, but really not major changes. With regard to dietary fat, again, we've been rather more general in 2023 than we were to start off with. We were much more specific in terms of numbers. But fascinatingly, that 10% of saturated fat has again remained constant. Protein, we've been a little bit more detailed, but intriguingly, I gave a talk in Oslo to this group. I think it was 2004. Did we have a meeting in Oslo? I think it was around about that time. I've actually got the slide, so I know that it was in Oslo. And I made the comments, amazing how our recommendations have held up remarkably well. Pardon? 2010, was it? Yeah. Well, 2010 held up remarkably well. Little change from 2000 to 2004. There weren't any recommendations between 2004 and 2010. And the major development at that stage was the importance for nutrition in the prevention of diabetes. It was post the era of the Finnish Diabetes Prevention Study, the DPP, and several other studies. And I just want to end this part of my talk by saying, I think I could use almost the same slide, but add in remission as something which is immensely important that's happened, and that we've actually moved more towards food. We've still stuck with some of the basic principles that we've had of nutrient proportions. So I think we've done really pretty well in terms of our guidelines. and we can be quite proud of our achievements. With regard to implementation, I think what we really did initially, we were very concerned about our colleagues in the medical profession, particularly, dismissing the role of dietitians, dismissing the role of nutrition, and we aimed very much to try and support the incredibly important work the dietitians were doing. And it would be interesting to hear from some of the dietitians here the extent to which we helped to actually raise the status and the importance of dietitians. The other thing which I think we did, we actually advertised the work of our group to a very considerable extent. We had regular symposia at the ESD conferences, the ESD meetings, wherever they were held in Europe. And we really, I think, made our voices heard fairly well in this country. And I think many of us were invited to the States because at that stage, I think we had, to some extent, we were getting better cover than was happening in some parts of the US at that stage. Now, I would like to really talk mainly, I had actually a very long list of directions for the future that I thought were interesting, but I'm really just going to concentrate on one because a number of the directions that I was going to talk about have actually been incredibly well covered at this meeting. And I think it's really exciting to see some of the directions we are going. But I do want to talk about the bigger picture of implementation, because for two reasons, I think that we've been a little bit too focused on patients with diabetes, to some extent forgetting two things. We've always said that the diet that's suitable for diabetes is suitable for the families, and families don't need to cook differently. That's good, we've always done that. But in fact, in the real world, people are eating in a very unfriendly food environment, a food environment that's very unfriendly to our guidelines. And number two, we've actually got a problem of food security in Europe and many other parts of the world. And in fact, the EU drew attention to a very major problem of food insecurity in the broadest term. And if people are food insecure, and if poverty is an issue, they're even less likely to follow the guidelines. So I think that we really need to give as a group, both in terms of research and in terms of spreading the gospel, as it were, the importance of the food environment. And I've just tried to summarize on this slide what we need to do to enable people to make good food choices. Of course, people need to be able to have enough money to actually buy the food. But there are issues in relation to the healthier food environment, which are absolutely pivotal, that there's minimal action by governments in Europe and worldwide going on. One is fiscal policies. There were a couple of slides that I saw over the last few days where people talked about taxing sugar-sweetened drinks, for example. We'll come back to that in a moment. But that's one thing that we need to look at in improving the food environment. Appropriate labeling, it's extraordinary how unsatisfactory labeling is. I'll come back to that in a moment too. Food reformulation, that's been taking place, but very slowly and not at the pace required. The regulating marketing is something which has not been done very much in relation to food. When you think of how we regulate the marketing of cigarettes, I mean, is bad food not as bad smoking? I mean, it's every bit as bad in my opinion. And then sustainability, which has come up in a number of ways. And without those things going on in the background, we're not going to have a good food environment, and we're not going to have people choosing healthy diets. Just show you one thing. I mean, sugar taxing has been going on there in the background for an incredibly long time. And sometimes it's been introduced and sometimes it's been done away with. But this is a meta-analysis done by some of my colleagues in New Zealand. And it seems unequivocal that where sugar taxing has been done, probably most successfully in the South Pacific nations. They've done a great job with sugar taxing. Roughly a 10% tax leads to a 10% reduction in sugar-sweetened beverages. And in fact, I don't know how many of you have seen this, But NUGAG, the Nutrition Guidelines Group of the World Health Organization, have come out with a statement 2 weeks ago. So this is an official WHO policy relating to fiscal policies to promote healthy diets. And they've actually come out specifically in relation to, with a strong recommendation, recommending an implementation of a policy to tax sugar-sweetened beverages. Very few countries have it if you look at it overall. They've actually gone one step further and said, is making a conditional recommendation to look at taxing of other inappropriate foods or unhealthy foods, and to look at the possibility of subsidizing healthier foods. So I think that this is something that we should be drawing attention to. And just as a little aside, you might say, well, what has this got to do with, the nutrition group of Associated Study of Diabetes? Well, it's got everything to do. It's totally our business, in my opinion, because we've got a global epidemic, indeed a global pandemic of diabetes. And if we want to do something about it, we've got to change the food environment. We can't just be making recommendations. And anyway, I mean, if it's good for diabetes, it's going to be good for coronary heart disease, good for cancer. And maybe diabetes should be leading the world, because the evidence is strongest, really, for obesity and diabetes. And we can get the cancer people and the heart people on board. There are other things in terms of what we should be doing and can be doing in the bigger picture thing. And this is kind of research, and it's jolly difficult research to do. Are there ways that go beyond telling people what they should be doing? And again, we've had one or two papers that have mentioned this at this symposium here, looking at the provision of food for people for a certain period of time, to try and give them an indication of how relatively easy it is to change your diet. And this is a paper which you may have seen published very recently, The Effects of an Intensive Food as Medicine Program. I don't kind of like that term, food as medicine program, but it is the provision of healthy foods. This is one, as I say, published in JAMA very recently, which was, in terms of experimental design, really very good. Control group was a waiting control group. They were going to get the foods for their whole family, but they had to wait for 6 months before they could get it. The treatment group got the food right from the beginning and then continued to get it all the way through. And you can see the confusion that arose here, because this looks like a negative trial, doesn't it? Both groups did quite extraordinarily well, actually, just old units for hemoglobin A1C, 10% to 8%, pretty good, but the control group did as well. Well, it's hardly surprising. In fact, I don't know if anybody here was involved in this study, but the control group got fabulous care long before they got the food. They all were part of the same healthcare provider and knew exactly what was going on. And so the contamination that must have taken place was enormous. And so they ended up with a beautifully done study, but with major contamination. The issue of food labeling, in my opinion, in terms of improving the food environment, is really a bit of a mess. I didn't kind of realize that the EU, quite a long time ago, decided that trying to get involved in food for diabetes was too complicated and they weren't going to go there. So we've got a situation with food labeling, which is, with respect, and again, there's been some discussion about this, which is really, I don't know how helpful most people with diabetes or people that want to prevent diabetes, coronary heart disease or cancer, how helpful this is for the majority of people. And I think it's really good that we've been talking a little bit here about labeling, but I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done about labeling. And in terms of any food policy, anything to improve the food environment, and I don't really want to say too much about this because a lot of people have talked about sustainability, but this has all got to be done in the context of sustainability. And I showed somebody these slides and they said, what's that sort of funny nut looking thing there? Well, that's an almond, if you don't recognize it in an almond. And we're busy recommending nuts left, right, and center. Couldn't have anything less sustainable than an almond, could you? So I think maybe we've got to be a bit more specific too about some of our advice. But my overall message that I want to make here is that I really think we've got to be moving into bigger picture stuff, basically. and we have to be doing research in that bigger picture stuff. And I think we've got to be proselytizing a bit more. I don't know when the last symposium was at an EASD meeting, but I don't think there have been symposia regularly. We've got to go out there and be pushing our wares much harder than we've done. I think it would be great if we collaborated more with the cardiovascular people, who always seem to have more clout than we do, and the cancer people, who have a lot more clout than the cardiovascular people, on this crusade that we need to undertake. So I think we've done a fabulous job. By the way, I know that I've pretty much got about two minutes left. My original talk, if I'd given the original talk, I would be about halfway. But I know that I'd be carried off still talking, and I didn't want to take that risk. But the big point that I really wanted to make, because as I've said, so many of the other issues I wanted to make have been made to some extent by others, is let's just think a bit bigger than we've been thinking up to now. And I think that's enough for me, and I've done it in 21 minutes. So thank you.
Very well in connecting the past and the future. There is much to reflect on this, but also for the group as a group. So to take advantage of your reflection, and certainly we will consider them in the future activities of the group. Thank you again.